In the autumn of 2020, respected geologist Elias Vance walked into the sprawling mouth of the Lost Creek Caverns in West Virginia and never walked out. He vanished without a trace, leaving behind a mystery that baffled investigators and froze his wife's world for 5 agonizing years. The case went cold, another file collecting dust. Then, a construction crew excavating the foundation for a new suburban home unearthed something that had been deliberately buried, a discovery that would reveal the horrifying truth of what really happened to Elias Vance and prove that the most terrible secrets are not lost in the wild, but sealed in concrete. Julia Vance stood over her drafting table, the sharp, clean lines of a landscape plan a stark contrast to the chaos that still lived in her mind. For 5 years, this room and the order within it had been her only defense. The house was quiet. It had been for 1,126 days. The kind of profound silence that presses in on you, a constant reminder of the voice that is missing. Her cell phone rang, tearing through the stillness. She glanced at the screen. An unknown number. A West Virginia area code. A cold jolt, a familiar phantom limb of dread and hope shot through her. She let it ring twice before her hand moved, almost of its own accord. "This is Julia Vance." Her voice was steady, a practiced calm. "Mrs. Vance," a man's voice said. It sounded young, cautious. "My name is Detective Miller. I'm with the Monongalia County Sheriff's Department." The name of the county, a place she hadn't let herself think about in years, was a key turning a rusted lock in her memory. "I'm calling," the detective continued, "in reference to your husband, Elias Vance." Elias. Elias, his face alive with energy, is double-checking the contents of a rugged duffel bag on the kitchen table. He is vibrant, alive, his eyes sparkling with the thrill of his work. He holds up a small, high-tech device, the Disto X2. "The magic wand, Jules," he says, grinning at her. "Today, it's going to map a whole new world under our feet." Julia leans against the counter, a warm mug of coffee in her hands. She smiles, a genuine, easy smile she hasn't worn in 5 years. "Just be careful in that new world, Eli. Some of us are quite fond of the one up here." He crosses the kitchen in 3 strides and wraps his arms around her, the rough fabric of his jacket smelling like canvas and cool morning air. "Always," he whispers, kissing her forehead. "I've got too much to come home to." He picks up his bag, slings it over his shoulder, and pauses at the back door. He gives her one last look, that lopsided smile she loved. "I'll be back by dinner," he says. Then he walks out the door. The screen door claps shut behind him. Julia's knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of her desk. The ghost of her husband's smile faded, leaving only the detective's voice on the line. "Mrs. Vance, are you still there?" "Yes," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "I'm here. What about my husband?" "There's been a development in his case," Miller said, the formal words feeling hollow and inadequate. "A significant one." "A development?" The word was absurd. Cases don't develop after 5 years of dead silence. They decay. They are forgotten. "I can't go into specifics over the phone," the detective said, his tone firming up. He was back on his official script. We have recovered some of his personal effects. We need you to come to the station." Personal effects. Such a sterile term. A wallet, a boot. What could possibly survive 5 years in the belly of a cave? "Did you find him?" Julia asked, the question raw, stripped of all pretense. "Detective, please, just tell me if you found him." There was a pause. In that brief silence, Julia could hear the man on the other end weighing policy against humanity. "The circumstances of this discovery are complicated," he said, his voice softening slightly. "It's not what anyone expected. It would be better if we talked in person." Not what anyone expected. The phrase echoed in her head. The expectation had always been grim, but simple. A caving accident. Nature's unforgiving power. This was something else. This was complicated. A new kind of fear, sharp and intelligent, cut through the old, dull ache of grief. "I'm on my way," she said, her decision absolute. She ended the call without waiting for a reply. The quiet of the studio rushed back in, but it was different now. It was charged, electric. She stood frozen for a single heartbeat, staring at the empty doorway to the hall, the same doorway Elias had walked through 1,000 times. Then she moved, her keys, her purse. She didn't look back at the drafting table, at the carefully constructed lines of a life that no longer mattered. All that mattered was the 2-hour drive ahead, and the question that pounded in her head with every beat of her heart. After 5 years of silence, what in God's name did they find? The 2-hour drive to Morgantown was a blur of green hills and gray asphalt. Julia drove on autopilot, her mind a frantic storm of possibilities. Each mile marker that flashed past the window was a countdown to a truth she wasn't sure she could face. For 5 years, the unknown had been a form of torture, a vast empty space in her life. But now, she found herself terrified of that space being filled. The Monongalia County Sheriff's Department was a low brick building that looked more like a community college than a hub of law enforcement. It was squat, unassuming, and completely at odds with the magnitude of the moment. Detective Miller was waiting for her just inside the glass doors. In person, he looked even younger, his face etched with a sincere, uncomfortable sympathy. He didn't offer a handshake, just a quiet nod. "Mrs. Vance, thank you for coming so quickly." He led her down a long beige hallway that smelled of disinfectant and old paper. The walls were lined with framed photos of smiling deputies at community picnics, a cheerful facade that felt almost insulting. Each step echoed on the linoleum floor, a drumbeat marching her toward the answer she'd both craved and dreaded. He stopped at a door marked Evidence Intake. "What we found is in here," he said, his hand hesitating on the knob. "I want to prepare you. It's in perfect condition." Julia didn't understand what he meant. How could anything be in perfect condition after 5 years? The room was cold, lit by the unforgiving hum of fluorescent tubes. In the center, on a wide steel table, sat a familiar object, a pelican case. It was the same rugged black plastic box Elias had used to protect his most sensitive equipment. It was caked in a thick layer of reddish damp clay, but otherwise it was unscratched, undented. Her breath caught in her throat. "A crew at the Oakwood Preserve Development found it this morning," Miller explained, keeping his voice low and steady. "They were digging a foundation trench on Lot 34. The backhoe operator hit it at about 4 feet down, said it was buried neatly, laid flat, directly under where they were about to pour a concrete slab." He moved to the table and with a deliberate motion wiped some of the clay from the latches. Julia could see they weren't corroded. "It was sealed tight," the detective said. He flicked open the 2 latches. The case opened with a soft but distinct hiss, the sound of a hermetic seal breaking, releasing air that had been trapped for years. The air of the day Elias disappeared. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was his gear. The sight stole the air from Julia's lungs. It was all there, his Petzl headlamp, a small bag of spare lithium batteries, and in the main cutout, the sleek yellow body of his Disto X2 surveying tool. It was immaculate. There was no sign of water damage, no rust on the metal components, no mildew on the foam. It looked as if he had packed it yesterday. "This is impossible," she whispered, reaching out a trembling hand but not daring to touch it. "If he fell in the cave, if there was a flood, it would have been destroyed, filled with silt." "He didn't fall in the cave, Mrs. Vance," Miller said softly. "Wherever he is, this equipment wasn't with him." This was it, the final, undeniable confirmation. Elias hadn't just had an accident. Someone had taken this case, with this gear inside it, and buried it. Buried it where it was never meant to be found. The last, stubborn embers of hope for a simple, tragic explanation were extinguished, leaving only a cold, dark certainty. This was not an accident. This was a crime. She finally allowed her fingers to brush the smooth plastic surface of the Disto X2. It was cold, like a stone from a riverbed. "It's his," she said, her voice hollow. "It's all his." Detective Miller led her to a small, windowless interview room. He brought her a cup of water in a styrofoam cup, the gesture of practiced procedure. "Our tech analyst pulled the data from the device," he began, opening a laptop on the small table between them. "The Disto X2 uses an internal solid-state drive. Everything is time-stamped. We were able to reconstruct the entire last day of his survey." He turned the screen toward her. On it was a complex 3D wireframe map of the Lost Creek Caverns, a web of passages and rooms that Elias had meticulously rendered into existence. "He finished his work in the cave at 3:47 p.m., Miller said, pointing to a timestamp on the screen. "Then, according to the device's GPS, he traveled out of the cave system. The last data ping, the final recording the device made, was at 4:12 p.m. He switched from the 3D map to a satellite image. A single red dot blinked on the screen. "This is the location of that final ping," Miller said. "It's a clearing just off the main access road, about a quarter mile from the cave entrance." Julia stared at the blinking red dot. It felt like she was looking at the last recorded heartbeat of her husband's life. The detective slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a copy of a witness statement dated 5 years ago. "This is the official statement provided by his partner, Marcus Thorne," Miller said, his voice now losing its gentle edge, becoming more clinical. "He stated that Elias went back into the cave for one last look, and he agreed to wait at the truck for him. He gave the location of the truck." He tapped a finger on the map, right next to the blinking red dot. "They're the same spot, Mrs. Vance. The device pinged its last signal from the exact location where Marcus Thorne claimed to be waiting. Elias made it back to the truck." Julia felt a wave of nausea. "Marcus, he said he never saw him again." "That's what he said," Miller affirmed, his eyes holding hers. "We always had our doubts about Mr. Thorne's story. It felt incomplete. Now we know it was a lie." He leaned forward slightly. "We did a background check on him this morning, a deep one. It turns out Marcus Thorne has a problem. A significant gambling addiction. For the last 7 years he's been racking up incredible amounts of debt. We found evidence of high-interest private loans, maxed-out credit cards. He was desperate." The detective let that hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final damning piece of information. "When Elias was declared legally dead, Mr. Thorne, as his sole research partner, became the beneficiary of your husband's remaining federal research grants. It was over $100,000, enough to clear a good portion of his debts." The theory was laid out before her, cold and logical and inescapable. "We believe they met at the truck," Miller said, his voice flat, laying out the official narrative. "We believe Elias confronted him. Maybe about the money, maybe about his work ethic. An argument started, it escalated, it became physical. And Mr. Thorne, a desperate man, did something terrible. He panicked. He couldn't leave Elias's body there, but he couldn't leave the gear either. The Disto X2 contained a perfect GPS record of their final meeting place. So he took it all, drove to that construction site, a place he knew would soon be covered in tons of concrete, and he buried it. All of it." Julia shook her head, a slow, disbelieving motion. "No," she said. The word was quiet but absolute. "Mrs. Vance." "No," she repeated louder this time, looking directly at the detective. "Not Marcus. He wouldn't. He couldn't." She thought of Marcus. Awkward, perpetually flustered Marcus. A man who was more comfortable with seismic charts than with people. A man who envied Elias, yes. A man who was probably lazy and maybe even a little dishonest with his finances. But a killer? He wasn't violent, Julia insisted. He hated confrontation. He would run from a fight, not start one. This isn't him. "People do things they never thought they could when they're desperate," Miller countered, his expression hardening with the conviction of his theory. "The evidence points to him. The motive is there. The lie is proven. Right now, everything points directly at Marcus Thorne." Julia left the station and walked into the blinding afternoon sun. The world seemed too bright, too loud, too normal for the horror she now carried. She got into her car, the cheap styrofoam cup still in her hand, and sat for a long moment, staring blankly through the windshield. The police had their story. It was a neat, tidy box, motive, opportunity, a lie. They would pursue Marcus and the case would be closed, but her gut screamed that they were wrong. The image of that pristine gear packed away so carefully in its case didn't feel like the work of a man in a panicked rage. It felt deliberate, calculated, cold. It was a burial, not a disposal. The police had answered the question of what happened, but as Julia started the engine, a new, more urgent question took its place, burning in her mind. They were wrong about the who. She was sure of it. But if Marcus Thorne didn't kill her husband, then who did? And how could she possibly prove it? The days that followed were a thick, grey fog. Julia moved through her house like a stranger, the quiet rooms echoing with the police's tidy, sensible theory. Marcus Thorne did it. The words played on a loop in her mind, a mantra of official certainty. It was a story that made sense to everyone but her. Every time she closed her eyes, she didn't see Marcus in a fit of rage. She saw the Pelican case. She saw the pristine equipment nestled in its foam cradle. It wasn't the aftermath of a panicked, violent crime. It was a burial, a ritual. The police had arrested Marcus. His face, pale and bewildered, had been on the local news. He denied everything, but his story was flimsy, his alibi non-existent. The evidence, Detective Miller had assured her, was circumstantial but strong. The case was, for all intents and purposes, closed. But for Julia, it felt like the lock had just been picked. She couldn't work. The clean lines on her drafting table seemed to mock her. How could she design perfectly ordered landscapes when the foundation of her own life was built on a lie? Frustrated and adrift, she found herself standing before a door she hadn't opened in 5 years. Elias's office. After he disappeared, she had locked it, unable to face the epicenter of his life, the room that was more purely him than any other. It had remained a sealed time capsule, a monument to her unresolved grief. Her hand trembled as she turned the key. The lock clicked, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent house. She pushed the door open. The air inside was still, thick with the scent of old paper, pipe tobacco, a habit he'd never managed to quit, and something that was just Elias. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light slanting through the window. Nothing had been moved. A geological map of West Virginia, riddled with colored pins marking cave systems, covered one entire wall. Bookshelves overflowed with dusty tomes on speleology and sedimentology. His favorite armchair, a worn leather behemoth, sat in the corner, the imprint of his body still visible in the cushion. On his large oak desk, a stack of papers sat next to a cold, empty pipe. This was not a room of ghosts. It was a room waiting for its occupant to return. Julia walked slowly to the desk, her fingers tracing the rim of the pipe's bowl. She had always hated the smell, but now she would have given anything to smell it one more time. She sat down in his chair. It was big, swallowing her small frame, but it felt like an embrace. She was here for a reason, though she didn't know what it was. She wasn't looking for a clue. The police had their clues. She was looking for a connection, for a piece of him that made more sense than the story she'd been told. Her eyes fell on the stack of papers. They were his field logs and project binders, organized with his unique brand of chaotic precision. He had been consulting on several local projects before he vanished, lending his geological expertise to construction and mining companies. She picked up the top binder, its plastic cover coated in a fine layer of dust. The label on the spine read, Oakwood Preserve, Preliminary Assessment. Her heart gave a painful thud. Oakwood Preserve. The place where he was found, the place where her 5 years of uncertainty had been given a grim, concrete answer. She opened it. Inside were topographical maps, soil composition charts, and pages of Elias's familiar sprawling handwriting. As a landscape architect, she understood what she was looking at. It was a standard geological workup for a major housing development. Developers needed to know the land was stable before they could build. She flipped through the pages, her mind drifting back. Elias is spread out on the living room floor, surrounded by the same maps and charts from the binder. He's tracing a line on a map with his finger, a deep furrow of concentration on his brow. Julia sits on the couch, a book in her lap, watching him. "Find any buried treasure?" she asks, smiling. He looks up, his expression serious. "Maybe the opposite," he says. "The developers of that new Oakwood project have a potential problem, a big one." He points to a section of the map. The whole area is karst terrain, limestone. It's riddled with voids and fissures under the surface. It's stable for the most part, but my initial readings show a significant anomaly right here. He taps the map. A weak zone, a high probability of sinkholes. You can't build a multi-million-dollar housing development on land that might swallow itself. "Can they fix it?" she asks. He shrugs, running a hand through his already messy hair. "Maybe. They could try to fill the voids with grout, reinforce the foundations. But it would cost a fortune. It would probably bankrupt the project." He gathers the papers, a weary look on his face. "I have to meet with the lead developer tomorrow, a guy named David Chen. He's not going to be happy." Julia's hands were shaking as she stared at the binder. A sinkhole, a fatal flaw in the land. But that was impossible. The Oakwood Preserve was nearly complete. Dozens of million-dollar homes were already built. The county would never have issued the permits if the land was unstable. The official geological reports must have been clean. She flipped further into the binder. Tucked into a back pocket was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't one of Elias's field notes. It was a formal letter, printed on the thick, expensive letterhead of the Chen Development Group. It was dated just 2 days before Elias disappeared. She unfolded it. "Elias," it began, "thank you again for meeting with me yesterday. Your insights were invaluable. I appreciate you bringing the anomaly to my attention privately. It's a sensitive issue, and your professional discretion in this matter is deeply appreciated. As discussed, we will be moving forward with our own internal survey to confirm your findings. In the meantime, I've enclosed the initial consultation fee we agreed upon. I look forward to your continued expert guidance as we navigate this delicate phase of the project. Sincerely, David Chen." Julia read the letter once, then twice. The words seemed to lift off the page, rearranging themselves in her mind. Professional discretion, delicate phase, consultation fee. This wasn't the letter a developer sends to a geologist who is about to condemn his project. This was the letter you send to someone you've paid for their silence. David Chen. She remembered his voice on the phone, so smooth, so sympathetic. He had offered her access to the geological reports himself. The police theory was that Marcus killed Elias for $100,000 in grant money. But this letter hinted at a secret worth millions. The entire fate of the Oakwood Preserve project. Elias had found a fatal flaw in the land. He was a man of principle. He would have been ethically bound to report it. But David Chen's letter sounded like he had convinced Elias to keep it quiet. Or at least, that he believed he had. This was the inconsistency, the seed of doubt. The police were focused on Marcus Thorne, on a simple, greedy motive. They had never even looked at the project itself. They had no reason to. The official geological surveys filed with the county must have been perfect. But Julia knew her husband. Elias would never have agreed to falsify a report. He would never have taken a bribe to endanger future homeowners. He would have fought it. So what happened after this letter was sent? A cold, terrifying thought began to form in her mind. What if Elias took the money, pretended to agree, but was planning to expose David Chen anyway? What if their final meeting wasn't at the cave at all? What if it was with a desperate developer who had everything to lose? Julia stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs. The dusty, silent room no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like the beginning of a map. She looked at the letter from David Chen, then at the binder full of Elias's meticulous, honest work. The two documents told two completely different stories, and somewhere in the space between them lay the truth. She had to see the official reports, the ones David Chen had filed with the county, the ones he had so graciously offered to her. She pulled out her phone, her hands steady now, her purpose clear. She wasn't a grieving widow anymore. She was an investigator. She found the number for the Chen Development Group. She would call him. She would accept his offer. She would get those reports, and she would find the lie. Julia's finger hovered over the call button on her phone, David Chen's name glowing on the screen. The developer, the man who had sent that letter, the man whose smooth, sympathetic voice was now laced with suspicion in her mind. She took a breath and pressed the screen. It rang twice. David Chen. His voice was just as she remembered, warm, professional, and calm. "Mr. Chen, it's Julia Vance." "Mrs. Vance," he said, a note of gentle concern entering his tone. "I was just thinking about you. I heard the police made an arrest. I hope this brings some measure of peace for you." The performance was flawless. Julia felt a chill despite the warmth in his voice. "Thank you," she said, her own voice carefully measured. "That's actually why I'm calling. In a way, things are clearer now. But I find myself still trying to understand my husband's last project. You were kind enough to offer me the official geological reports for Oakwood Preserve. I was hoping that offer still stood." There was a slight pause, but when he spoke, the warmth was still there. "Of course, absolutely. I think understanding his work is a wonderful way to honor his memory. The site office is open all day. Would you like to come by this afternoon? I can walk you through them myself." "This afternoon would be perfect," Julia said. "Thank you, Mr. Chen. I appreciate your kindness." "Think nothing of it," he said. "We're all hoping your family can begin to heal." She hung up the phone, her hand unsteady. His kindness felt like a weapon, a smooth, polished stone. Before she allowed herself to second-guess her plan, she dialed Detective Miller. He picked up on the first ring. "Miller." "Detective, it's Julia Vance. I've found something." She quickly explained what she'd discovered in Elias's office. The notes about the karst anomaly, the high probability of sinkholes, the letter from David Chen thanking Elias for his discretion. She waited for a reaction, an acknowledgement that this changed things. Instead, she was met with a tired sigh. "Mrs. Vance," Miller said, his voice patient but strained, "I understand you're looking for answers everywhere, but what you're talking about is a civil matter, a business dispute between a developer and a consultant. It has nothing to do with our homicide case." "But it's a motive," Julia insisted, her frustration rising. "A multi-million-dollar motive. It's bigger than the grant money Marcus supposedly killed him for." "We have Marcus Thorne in custody," Miller said flatly. "His finances show clear motive, and his lie about your husband returning to the truck puts him at the scene. It's a solid case. A disagreement between your husband and a developer from 5 years ago doesn't change that." "So you're not even going to look into it?" she asked, incredulous. "There's nothing to look into," he said, his tone final. "The land was certified by a geological firm. The county issued the permits. It was deemed safe. Your husband must have been mistaken in his initial assessment. Please, Mrs. Vance, let us handle the investigation. We have our man." The line went dead. Julia sat in the silence of Elias's office, the phone still pressed to her ear. She was alone in this. The police had their neat, tidy story, and they weren't interested in anything that might complicate it. She looked at the letter in her hand. He must have been mistaken. But Elias was never mistaken about geology. He read the earth like other people read a book. If the police wouldn't find the truth, she would have to. The Oakwood Preserve site office was a pristine modular building, a temporary command center for a multi-million-dollar operation. David Chen greeted her at the door with a warm handshake and led her to a large conference table. On it sat a thick, professionally bound report. The cover was glossy, embossed with the gold leaf logo of the Oakwood Preserve. "Here we are," he said, opening the binder. "The official geotechnical survey. As you can see, everything was found to be well within safety parameters." He flipped through the pages, pointing out borehole logs and seismic data charts. To Julia's eye, it all looked perfect. Too perfect. There was no mention of any anomaly, no hint of the karst void Elias had been so concerned about. According to this report, the ground beneath them was as solid as a mountain. "It all looks very thorough," Julia said, her voice neutral as she scanned the pages. "We pride ourselves on it," David said with a confident smile. "Safety is our #1 priority." His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it with a flicker of annoyance. "Forgive me, Mrs. Vance, I have to take this. A concrete supplier. Feel free to look through the report as long as you need." He stood and walked to the far side of the office, his back to her, his voice dropping into a hushed professional murmur. Julia's eyes scanned the document, her heart pounding. She was looking for a flaw, a crack in the facade. She turned back to the title page, her gaze falling on the fine print at the bottom. Geotechnical survey and certification provided by Bedrock Solutions Inc. Bedrock Solutions. The name sounded solid, reliable, almost generic. Something about it snagged in her mind. She discreetly took out her phone, shielding the screen with her body. Under the table, she typed the company name into the search bar. The results loaded instantly. Her blood ran cold. There were no results, no website, no business registration, no address. A few auto-generated directory listings with no information. The company didn't exist. It was a ghost, a complete fabrication. The report in front of her wasn't just inaccurate, it was a forgery. At that exact moment, her own phone began to vibrate in her hand. It was an unknown number. She quickly silenced the ringer, her eyes darting toward David Chen, who was still on his call. She stood up, pretending to stretch, and walked toward the window, turning her back to him as she answered in a whisper. "Hello? Julia? Julia Vance?" The voice was panicked, ragged. "It's Marcus. Marcus Thorne." "Marcus," she breathed, shocked. "They let you go?" "Just now," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of relief and terror. "My lawyer, he found it. The alibi. The poker tournament I was at? It was a charity event hosted by a tech company. The whole thing was live-streamed online. My lawyer found the archived video. It shows me at the table, time-stamped, clear as day. I was there the entire afternoon. I was never at the truck. The police, they had to release me." The world seemed to tilt under Julia's feet. Marcus was innocent. The police theory had completely collapsed, and the only person left... She turned her head slightly, looking back at David Chen. He had just ended his call and was watching her, his friendly mask slipping for just a fraction of a second. His eyes weren't warm now. They were hard and watchful. He had seen her take the call. In that instant, everything became terrifyingly clear. Elias discovered the flaw in the land. He refused to be silenced. And so David Chen, the helpful, sympathetic developer, had silenced him forever. He had created a fake geology firm, forged a report worth millions, and buried her husband under a foundation of lies. "Julia, are you there?" Marcus asked, his voice frantic on the line. "The police were wrong. Someone else was there with Elias. Someone else." "I know, Marcus," she whispered, her gaze locked with David Chen's across the room. "I think I know who." She ended the call. David walked toward her, his smile back in place, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Everything all right, Mrs. Vance?" "Everything is fine," she said, her voice belying the terror that was screaming through her veins. She had to get out. Now. "You know," he said, stopping a few feet from her, "there's something you should see. Since you're so interested in the geology of this place, the real reason I had to be so careful. It's better if I show you." A primal instinct screamed at her to run, but she thought of Elias. She had to know. "Show me," she said. He led her out of the site office and into the late afternoon sun. The construction site was quieting down, the crews packing up for the day. He led her away from the remaining workers, toward an isolated lot at the far edge of the development. A deep, rectangular pit had been carved out of the red earth, its walls sheer and dark. The foundation for a new home. "Your husband was right," David said, his voice low as they stood at the precipice. There was an anomaly, a void. He was going to destroy everything my family had ever built. Look. He pointed down into the shadowy pit. You can see the fissure from here. Julia took a hesitant step forward, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness. She saw nothing but packed clay. Then she felt a powerful, unyielding force slam into the middle of her back. A cry was ripped from her throat as the world fell away. The sky, the trees, the figure of David Chen. All of it spun in a sickening vortex as she tumbled forward, down into the waiting earth. The world spun into a vortex of blue sky and red earth. Julia's scream was swallowed by the air as she tumbled down, landing with a sickening, bone-jarring impact on the hard-packed clay floor of the pit. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up from her ankle. She gasped, trying to draw a breath that wouldn't come, her vision swimming with black spots. 10 feet above her, David Chen stood at the edge, a dark silhouette against the glaring sun. The friendly mask was gone, melted away to reveal a face of pure animal panic. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice a ragged gasp. "I am so sorry. You couldn't leave it alone." He disappeared from view for a moment. When he reappeared, he was holding a long-handled shovel he'd grabbed from a nearby pile of tools. The steel blade glinted in the light. Julia scrambled backwards, dragging her useless leg, the rough clay scraping her palms raw. "David, don't do this," she pleaded, her voice hoarse. "He gave me no choice," he yelled, his voice echoing in the earthen pit. "Your husband, he was a good man, a man of principle, and that's why he had to die. Principles don't build houses, they don't feed families." He raised the shovel. Julia squeezed her eyes shut, a final terrible image of Elias's smiling face flashing in her mind. A piercing wail cut through the air, a siren. It was distant at first, a faint cry on the wind, but it grew louder with impossible speed. David froze, the shovel held high. His head snapped up, turning toward the sound. His face, which had been a mask of desperate rage, crumpled into one of utter disbelief. The siren was closer now, joined by another. They were coming here. He dropped the shovel. It clattered against the hard ground, the sound echoing his shattered composure. He looked down at Julia, his eyes wide with the horror of a trapped animal. "How?" he whispered. Julia didn't answer. She could only stare as a Monongalia County Sheriff's car, followed by another, careened around the corner of a half-built house and skidded to a stop in the dirt, its blue and red lights painting the scene in frantic, strobing colors. Detective Miller leaped from the driver's side, his gun drawn and held in a steady two-handed grip. "David Chen, get down on the ground, now!" he commanded, his voice booming with an authority Julia hadn't heard before. David stumbled back from the edge of the pit, his hands raised in surrender. It was over. The developer, the community builder, the man of vision, was gone. All that was left was a killer, cornered at the bottom of a hole he had dug for himself 5 years ago. With the immediate danger gone, the full force of her injury washed over Julia. A wave of dizziness made her slump back against the clay wall. Other officers were now surrounding the pit, shouting commands. Paramedics were running toward her, but her focus was on the man in the expensive suit, now on his knees in the dirt. Detective Miller stood at the edge, his gun still trained on Chen. "It's over, David," he said. And then, as if a dam had burst, the confession began. It wasn't a defiant snarl or a tearful plea. It was the quiet, hollowed-out voice of a man who had been running for 5 years and had finally been tackled. "My father started this company with nothing but a hammer and a loan from his brother," David said, his voice drifting down into the pit. "He built it into something that put food on the tables of 100 families. He trusted me with it, his legacy." He looked up at the half-finished houses of Oakwood Preserve, their wooden skeletons stark against the evening sky. But the world changed. Recessions, regulations. We were bleeding out. This project was our last shot. I leveraged everything. My home, my father's retirement, everything was riding on this land. His eyes found Julia's at the bottom of the pit. Then your husband came along. He was just doing a private survey for his own research. But he found it. The sinkhole. A geological cancer right under the heart of the development. He showed me the data. He was so calm, so professional about it. He told me he was ethically bound to report it to the county board. The confession poured out of him now, a torrent of desperate truth. I begged him. I offered him money, a stake in the company, anything he wanted. I told him he was destroying lives, not just a balance sheet, but he looked at me with this pitying expression. He said, "Some things are more important than money, Mr. Chen." He was going to make the call that afternoon. He recounted the final moments, the meeting at the edge of the property, the argument, the pleading. He turned his back on me to walk to his truck, and I saw a rock on the ground, a piece of slate. I didn't even think. I just picked it up and I hit him. He went down. He hit his head on another rock as he fell. He never moved again. David's voice cracked. It was an accident, the fight, it got out of control. But who would believe me? I was the developer with everything to lose, so I panicked. I put his body in my truck and drove to Lot 34. I knew they were pouring the foundation the next day. I buried him, right under where a family was supposed to have their living room. He explained the rest with a chilling, detached clarity. How he had taken Elias's pristine gear and buried it separately, a bizarre token of a respect he could no longer show. How he had gone back to his office that night, his hands still shaking, and created a ghost. Bedrock Solutions, Inc., a fake company, a forged report, a single digital lie to pave over a grave. By the time he finished, paramedics were carefully strapping Julia onto a backboard. As they lifted her from the pit, she saw the officers pulling David Chen to his feet, his wrists bound in handcuffs. The powerful developer was gone, replaced by a stooped, broken man being led to the back of a police car. Detective Miller approached her as the paramedics checked her ankle. His face was pale. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I should have listened to you. Your instinct, it was better than all of our evidence." "You're here now," she said, her own voice weak. "Chen confessed to everything," he confirmed. "Murder in the second degree, fraud, evidence tampering. He'll never see the outside of a prison again. We'll have a forensics team out here tomorrow. We'll bring Elias home. With dignity." Weeks later, Julia stood in her studio. The cast was off her ankle, replaced by a brace. The room was different now. The heavy, oppressive silence was gone. In its place was a quiet peace. On her drafting table, she wasn't sketching a corporate park or a private garden. She was designing a small public memorial, a simple circular stone bench surrounded by birch trees and wild grasses, the kind Elias had loved. A small bronze plaque was embedded in the center stone. It would be placed at the trailhead of the Lost Creek Caverns, not a place of tragedy, but a place of quiet reflection. She picked up a framed photograph from her desk. It was of her and Elias, standing on a mountaintop, the wind whipping their hair, both of them beaming at the camera. She ran her thumb over his smiling face. The truth hadn't brought him back. It hadn't erased the 5 years of suffocating uncertainty or the brutal finality of his death. But it had done something else. It had given him a voice. It had allowed his story, the story of a good man who died for his principles, to finally be told. She had found him, not in the dark, silent caves he had loved, but in the paper trail of a desperate lie. And in finding him, she had finally, after 5 long years, found her own way out of the dark.